Hi, this is Mrs. Huffcutt, and I've got another chapter, the penultimate chapter for Miss Hickory by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. Chapter 14, Squirrel Takes Revenge. Miss Hickory was unable to see her hand before her face at first because it was so dark inside the squirrel's hole. It appeared, though, as she became used to the dimness, a large and gloomy place. The floor was covered with cracked nutshells, and as she stepped carefully among them, she did not come upon a single whole nut. She might not have noticed what appeared to be an empty and ragged gray fur coat lying in a far corner, but the rattling of the shells as she made her way roused Squirrel. He lifted himself. "Who's that?" Squirrel asked in a faint voice. She went close and poked him with her foot. Just what was in my mind to ask," she said. "Why, it's you, Squirrel. You appear to be in a state of ill health." "Starving? That's what I am. Starving to death." Squirrel leaned limply against the wall of his hole. Not a nut left. Was it her imagination, or did he fix his eyes on her head? She backed away and spoke sternly to him. "What became of that large store of nuts that was here last fall?" "I ate them," he replied simply. "And the woods full of nuts that you could have buried?" she went on bitterly. "I told you about those at the time," he spoke patiently. "My memory's poor. Often the very moment I buried a nut, the next second when I turned my back on it, I forgot where it was. I did well to bring what nuts I did home. When the first thaw came out, I started out, ill as I was, to try and find a few that I had buried. Could I locate them? No, not one." He sank down to the floor again. "I told you last fall, and I tell you again, Squirrel," Miss Hickory shook a finger at him, "that you are a witless fellow. Why didn't you use your head? A brainless wastrel, that's what you are." That's a picture of her when she went into the hole. "Wastrel?" Squirrel jumped up, his rage giving him strength. "Do you know that if it were not for the nuts I bury and then forget, there would not be so many new nut trees in the woods? I plant trees, whether I mean to or not. Use my head, did you ask? What, I beg of you to explain, is the matter with your head, old nut, that you feel you can blame me, call me witless? Well," Miss Hickory could not move in fright as Squirrel lunged forward and put a heavy paw on her shoulder. "They say that 2 heads are better than 1. All this time I have spared you. Oh, I knew all about hickory nuts, so juicy and full of sweet meat, but I waited as long as possible. Now I must act. I hope you will understand," he finished jokingly, "that this hurts me more than it does you." And with that final bitter remark, Squirrel took off Miss Hickory's head and put it in his mouth. There's a picture of that happening. Strange as it seems, though separated from her body and beginning to crack in Squirrel's sharp teeth, Miss Hickory's head went right on thinking. In fact, it seemed to think faster than it ever had before, and aloud, "Crack! I never was a very useful head. Or perhaps it was the poor use to which you put me. A nut was not the proper headpiece for so tough a body as yours. Crack, crack! Too hard-headed you were altogether." As Squirrel crunched the head, it talked fast to Miss Hickory. "In the first place, you wouldn't realize how important a change of scene is until you were deserted, until Crow had practically to move you against your will to Robin's nest for the winter. Fancy, too, all the good adventures your hard head made you miss. You wouldn't believe Mr. T. Willard Brown when he invited you to see Cow being given a dose of medicine. You wouldn't believe Squirrel here when he told you about the Christmas Eve celebration in the barn. That was the worst of all your mistakes. You were too late in reaching the barn. You did not see the wonder in the manger there on Christmas Eve. Crack, crack, crack!" Now, almost eaten by Squirrel, there was little left of Miss Hickory's head to talk to her. It made one final effort and spoke. "Think what a pleasant life you've had. Sunsets and a mountain to look at, good clothes from the forest, and so many friends. Plenty to eat for the picking. The neighbors kind to you, and what have you ever done for anybody else? Oh, I grant that you did found a ladies' aid society, but that pleased your vanity. You lived selfishly all your life. You wouldn't even give away your hard head." But the voice of the nut broke off. It was completely cracked and eaten. Feeling her way, Miss Hickory groped and stumbled out of Squirrel's hole. She had lost her head, but not her arms and legs. For some strange reason, her body felt more alert and capable than when it had been hampered by a nut head. As her feet crossed the threshold of Squirrel's hole, that gentleman's every hair stood on end in horror. Seeing Miss Hickory's headless body moving erect and brisk gave him such a shock that he chattered to himself for days, and when he decided at last that he only dreamed the ghost walking of his friend, he reformed. He repented of having eaten Miss Hickory's head, and was a good squirrel forever after, gathering enough nuts for each winter and eating only 3 meals a day, with nothing between meals. On she went, her twig feet filling familiar stones and grass, her twig hands touching the bark of an old apple tree that she knew was home. If Miss Hickory's head had been on, it would have discouraged her. It might have spoken thus: "Robin will peck you. You can't see your lady slippers anyway, if that's what you're looking for. Lie down in the grass here and dry up." Those are the words the nuthead would have spoken. But without a brain, Miss Hickory gave vent to her feelings. There was not a drop of doubt or fear now in her freely running sap. She set one foot in a toe-hold of the rough bark of the apple tree, caught the tip of a low bough with both hands, and grasped it firmly. She gave a high kick and a swing, higher than she'd ever dare swing before. Now she caught the next higher bough, gripped it, and swung again. Up boughs went headless, heedless, happy Miss Hickory. The entire climb was pleasant. She knew from long living there all the apple tree's crooks and crotches. She felt the warm wind from the south. She threw away her spring clothes, sorry to do it, but she could climb better without them. Robin was so astonished when she reached the nest that he flew into the deep woods. His wife left to get worms, and that delayed the egg hatching for a week. In the meantime, another robin received a newspaper notice about his early babies. But when Miss Hickory reached her own nest, she only touched the blue eggs gently and then moved on. This situation of the nest was too shady, too sheltered. She felt the need of higher location than the apple tree, where the sun should be warmer, the winds higher, and the rains be her summer bath. She was surprised that she could climb so far, but the old apple tree grew every which way, gnarled in at angles. Every bough and twig felt like a home to Miss Hickory, who had lived among them so long. It never entered her mind that, since that she now had none, that she might be going too far, climbing too high. As she climbed and swung higher and higher, she could feel the sun on her body like a cloak of fiery gold, and the spring breezes coming down the mountain across the lea over the orchard blew her up, up, as if she had wings. You probably can't see it, but she's right there by the nest, climbing up that tree, and there's a squirrel down at the bottom. Miss Hickory had another feeling, strange and unexplainable. She felt knobby, as if she were budding. Her warm sap, like lifeblood, seemed bursting through her body, and as she went on higher and higher toward the top of the tree, she had a feeling of being really at home, as if she belonged there. All the way her hands found similar bumpy places on the tree's boughs. Finally, when she had left her nest, squirrel, high mowing all of her past life below, far down on the earth, she began to feel somewhat tired, even sleepy. Her twig feet and hands found a wide upper crotch in the apple tree. She pushed herself into it, and calling it a day, Miss Hickory rested there. I don't know if you can see that that's her right there. And now the last chapter of Miss Hickory by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. Chapter 15. Anything Can Happen. Now in May, the old place had opened its doors. The grandfather clock with the big brass pendulum ticked again. Tick-tock, tick-tock, time without end. The white towel that had wrapped the Bible was folded and put away. The old farmer's almanac opened at the May 5th month. Page hung on the wall. Through the windows came a lovely perfume, for the lilacs were in bloom. That's a picture of the lilacs. Anne, who had come home early from school in Boston, looked underneath the lilac bush at the ruins of a little house that Timothy on the next farm had made for her out of corn cobs. She looked at it sadly, for the doll whose body was an apple tree branch and whose head was a hickory nut with a sharply pointed nose was gone. Timothy came along, whistling. "What's the matter, Anne? Lost something?" He, too, looked beneath the lilac bush. "Miss Hickory," Anne told him. "She is gone, and her home that you made for me is broken up." "Well, we've had a hard winter," he told her. "Snow 5 feet deep, ice storms. You wouldn't expect that little house to stand up." "But Miss Hickory!" Anne was close to tears. "She's completely gone. You think, Timothy, that parts of her would be left in these ruins." "Now you listen to me, Anne," Timothy said. "You're too old to play with dolls. I'm too busy with the spring chores to make you another dollhouse. Just forget the whole thing." Anne turned on Timothy. I can't forget Miss Hickory. She wasn't just a doll. She was a real person born and bred in New Hampshire. I don't forget my friends, Timothy, and you ought to know that. There was no accounting for girls, he thought. He put his hands in his overall pockets and whistled. Far away, but answering, there came a hoarse caw, caw from the direction of the orchard. Crow, Timothy explained. He'll be talking to us before the summer's over. Birds don't talk, Anne said. Crow does, or at least he makes himself understood, Timothy told her. He's been places and seen life. He's a leader. And when he hears me whistle, if he has anything important to tell me, he answers back. Such as? Anne sounded skeptical. Well, Timothy said reasonably, if you don't believe me, if you think Crow's just talking through his hat, come along and see. Let's take a walk up through the orchard, Anne. A walk through an orchard. Through an orchard when the apple trees are in bloom. The sleeping beauty has awakened there. Daphne, dressed in her new draperies, flutters a welcome to Persephone, returning with her hands full of violets. The bluebird darts down with pieces of heaven on his wings. Anything wonderful can happen in an orchard. Anne and Timothy side by side crossed the road, and there on the far stone wall of the field called High Mowing sat an old crow in dingy black, uttering hoarse words as loudly as he could. When he saw the boy and girl, he flew, cawing, over on. He does sound as if he has something to say, Anne agreed as they followed him. Anne likes to hear himself hear himself say it, Timothy chuckled, then whistled. Caw, caw! Crow's answer came back to them from the side hill of the orchard where the mackintosh apples grew. Everything points to a good mackintosh year, Timothy went on. Last year it was the Baldwins that yielded, and the mackintoshes rested. Just look at their bloom. They stood a while looking at the beauty of the apple blossoms, pink and white all around and above Anne and Timothy. The orchard, as far as they could see, was blooming. It hung a pink curtain against the new green of Temple Mountain. All the worn crotches and ragged elbows of the gnarled trees were covered with blossoms. But Timothy was right. The mackintosh trees had the thickest, the loveliest bloom of all. They followed the row of trees, Timothy talking like a farmer, showing off to Anne. I always say there's nothing like our New Hampshire mackintoshes. That's an apple for you. Big, bright red, juicy, sweet-smelling, crunchy when you bite into it, pretty in the middle of a table, quick roasting in front of the fireplace on a cold evening. Timothy, stop, Anne laughed. You're making me too hungry. Well, he told her, I don't want you to think that there's nothing here in the country to come back to. Well, Timothy, there's everything. Anne took his hand, except for Miss Hickory. But he interrupted her. Here's a tree I've always liked, an old mackintosh that hasn't been pruned or grafted in I don't know how long. They thought it wasn't worth it. My grandfather planted it. But look at the old thing now, if it isn't blooming thicker than I ever saw it before. They stopped in front of an elderly mackintosh tree, so low and wildly branched that one could easily swing into it from the ground and climb up boughs. Timothy whistled. Crow answered harshly from above. Where's Crow? Anne asked. I don't know. I'll climb up and see, Timothy said, swinging carefully so as not to hurt the blossoms along the boughs of the old mackintosh tree. He whistled. Crow called loudly. Timothy followed Crow's call until he came to a high blooming branch that pointed off yonder toward the mountain. It was pinker than pink. It fluttered and danced like a ballerina, close at just above. There's a picture of Timothy up on the top of the tree and Crow. Whee! Timothy shouted down to Anne. I've found something up here. Can you climb up? Climb up, Crow spoke quite plainly. Easy does it. Caw, caw. Taking care not to hurt the blossoms, Anne swung and carefully stepped from one bough to another, almost as if she were climbing a ladder. Crow balanced, flapping and cawing above. When Anne came close to Timothy, he called excitedly, Look here! He pointed to the most flowery of all the branches. It's a scion. It's growing like anything, but who put it in, I ask you? Not me or anybody else, so far as I've heard. Anne looked. She saw the new dancing branch, its 2 arms, its slim little waist, its 2 legs, all garlanded with pink bloom. But it had a firm place in the apple tree there, held close in a crotch where the wind had broken the old bough and left a little sap-filled crack. A scion? Anne asked. Sure. That's what a new graft is called, put onto an old tree to start it blooming and bearing again. But we usually tape it until it begins to grow on the old branch, and that takes time. I don't understand. We didn't do any grafting this spring, and especially not on this back number of a Macintosh. Perched on a bough, Anne gently touched the blossoming scion. She thought but did not say. It looks like Miss Hickory up to the neck, but she had a head. Will it go on growing? Have an apple, maybe? Anne asked aloud. Bound to, Timothy said. This scion is so much at home in this tree now that it will buck up the whole tree, give it a new start. But what I don't understand is Timothy's words were taken out of his mouth by Crow, who flew off towards the pine woods, talking in harsh laughter as he went on. Caw, caw, ha, ha! Two-leggers think they can explain everything that goes on outdoors. As for Miss Hickory, who had been a scion all along without knowing it, she felt completely happy. She would never have to do any hard thinking again. She had a permanent home at last, and someday she would give Anne, who recognized her, a big red apple. And there she is, covered with blossoms. That is the end of Miss Hickory. A little bit about the author. Carolyn Sherwin Bailey was born in Hoosick Falls, New York, and spent her childhood in the little Hudson River town of Lansingburg, where she prepared for college at the local academy. She graduated from Teachers College, Columbia University, studied at the New York School of Social Work and in Rome, and then began writing, an activity which eventually produced 35 books. The author and her husband, Dr. Eben C. Hill, lived for many years on Hill Farm in Temple, New Hampshire, whose antiques and apple orchard inspired Miss Bailey's Newbery Award-winning book about the apple twig doll, Miss Hickory. And thank you for listening to Miss Hickory. And that's the end.